Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready for today's news?
Always. It's quite a mix today.
Yeah, we've got some pretty heavy hitters today, from Elon Musk to Trump.
Oh yeah, and don't forget that tragic fire in Turkey.
And some good news out of Thailand, too.
Definitely a lot to cover, so let's just get right to it.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Let's start with Elon Musk.
Hmm.
He was at Trump's inauguration, and...
Well, this is about that gesture, right?
Exactly. A lot of people are saying it looked a lot like a Nazi salute,
Yeah, and not just once, he did it twice.
which has sparked a pretty big debate online,
Some are defending Musk, saying it's because of his autism diagnosis.
that he didn't realize what it looked like.
Right, but then others are pointing out...
That he's been meeting with far-right groups like the AfD in Germany.
Yeah, and those folks have some pretty clear ties to neo-Nazi ideology.
It's definitely concerning because he has such a huge platform.
Millions of followers hanging on his every word.
Exactly. It really makes you think about the responsibility that comes with that kind of influence.
It does, for sure. Okay, so moving on, how about we talk about Trump?
Sure. On his first day back in office, he issued a blanket pardon,
For everyone involved in that January 6th Capitol riot.
a move that is already proving very controversial.
Well, it was a campaign promise, so it makes a lot of his supporters happy.
The ones who see the rioters as political prisoners.
Right, but his critics are saying it's a dangerous precedent.
That it basically endorses violence and undermines the rule of law.
And adding fuel to the fire, this pardon.
Covers everyone, even those convicted of serious crimes.
So yeah, definitely a lot of debate swirling around that one.
Okay, well, now for some tragic news out of Turkey.
The fire at that ski resort, the Grand Kartal Hotel.
It's just awful. At least 76 people died.
And a lot of them were forced to jump from windows to try and escape the blaze.
It took 12 hours to get that fire under control,
And 9 people have been arrested so far.
including the hotel owner.
They're still investigating what caused it.
Early reports say it might have started in the hotel's restaurant.
Up on the 4th floor, and there are some questions about whether,
The hotel had all the proper safety measures in place.
like whether they had installed that required automatic fire extinguisher system.
Just a heartbreaking situation all around,
It is, and it really highlights how important those safety regulations are.
especially in places like hotels where so many people are gathered.
For sure. Okay, well, let's switch gears now to some good news.
Definitely need some of that.
Thailand just became the first country in Southeast Asia.
To legalize same-sex marriage?
Huge victory for LGBTQ plus rights in the region.
I read that it was activists who really pushed for this.
Yeah, they worked with political parties and really got creative with their campaigning
Like using the popularity of those boy love dramas.
to help shift public opinion. It's actually really clever.
It is, and it seems to have worked because the law passed with very little opposition.
Which is pretty rare in Thailand's political climate these days.
A nice moment of unity for a change.
It is, and it makes you wonder,
If this could lead to similar changes in other Asian countries.
right, like could this be a turning point for LGBTQ plus rights across the region?
That's a really interesting question, and one we'll have to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. Okay, so ready for some more news from around the world?
Hit me with it.
Let's start with Israel.
Where things are pretty tense right now.
They just launched a major military operation in Jenin.
Called Iron Wall.
It's resulted in the deaths of 9 Palestinians,
And of course sparked outrage and calls for retaliation.
especially from Hamas.
It's a very volatile situation right now, and who knows what's going to happen next.
Hopefully things will calm down, but it's definitely a situation to watch.
For sure. Meanwhile, in Ukraine,
Their chief army psychiatrist was just arrested on corruption charges.
accused of racking up over $1 million in illicit wealth,
Since the war with Russia began,
which really highlights the ongoing issue of corruption in Ukraine.
even as they're fighting for their survival.
It's a sad reminder that war often makes existing problems even worse.
And creates opportunities for people to take advantage of the chaos.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of taking advantage,
Elon Musk has downplayed his controversial gesture at Trump's inauguration,
dismissing the accusations as tired.
which probably won't do much to quiet the critics.
Probably not.
Oh.
Okay, so in other news, there's been a stabbing attack in Tel Aviv.
4 people were injured.
And the attacker, a 28-year-old foreign national, was shot dead at the scene.
Hamas hasn't officially taken credit,
But they did release a statement praising the attack.
which just adds to the tension and fear in the region.
Yeah, it feels like every day there's a new wave of violence and uncertainty.
It's exhausting. And to make matters worse in Ukraine,
They're dealing with another problem now,
Drug-resistant bacteria are spreading rapidly.
creating a serious public health threat.
All the war injuries overwhelmed medical facilities and patients being transferred between hospitals.
It's created the perfect conditions for these superbugs to thrive,
And doctors are finding it harder and harder to treat infections.
because the bacteria are becoming resistant to even the strongest antibiotics.
It's a reminder of just how devastating and long-lasting the consequences of war can be.
Yeah, they go way beyond the battlefield.
Absolutely. Okay, so enough doom and gloom for now. How about some good news?
I'm all ears.
Onyx Storm, the latest book in Rebecca Yaros's Romantasy series, just came out.
And fans are going crazy for it.
Yaros has a real knack for storytelling, and she's created this amazing world.
That readers just can't get enough of.
The pre-order sales were through the roof, so it's definitely going to be another big hit for her.
That's great to hear. And speaking of breaking records and hitting milestones,
The Haas Formula One team has appointed Laura Muller as F1's first female race engineer.
that's amazing.
Huge step forward for women in motorsport.
Which has always been such a male-dominated field.
It's a real sign of progress and hopefully just the beginning.
Absolutely.
Okay, so back in the U.S., Trump has been busy signing executive orders.
Covering all sorts of issues, from healthcare to immigration,
And one that's getting a lot of attention is his decision,
to start pulling the U.S. out of the World Health Organization.
which has a lot of people worried about what it means for global health.
Especially since the U.S. is the WHO's biggest funder.
Critics are saying this move could really hinder efforts to fight infectious diseases.
And make it harder to respond to future pandemics.
And there's also the concern that it could give China more power within the WHO.
Definitely a lot of potential ramifications to think about there.
No doubt. Okay, so shifting focus now to a situation that's causing a lot of international concern.
What's that?
There are 48 Uyghur refugees being detained in Thailand right now
They fled China's Xinjiang region,
and are afraid of being sent back.
where they fear they'll face persecution and imprisonment,
Human rights groups are urging Thailand to not deport them.
and to consider the well-documented human rights abuses against Uyghurs in China.
It's a desperate situation, and hopefully the international community can put pressure on Thailand to do the right thing.
I hope so too.
Mm.
Meanwhile, back in the U.S., there is some good news.
The U.S. just negotiated the release of 2 American detainees.
Who are being held by the Taliban in Afghanistan.
It was part of a prisoner exchange.
The U.S. released an Afghan prisoner who was serving a life sentence here.
For drug trafficking and terrorism charges?
It's definitely a relief that those Americans are coming home.
But it does highlight the complicated relationship between the U.S. and the Taliban after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Definitely a lot of nuances to unpack there.
No doubt. Okay, ready for some more of Trump's executive orders?
Lay it on me.
This one's about gender.
Oh boy, this is going to be controversial.
It sure is. Trump just signed an executive order saying that the U.S. government,
We'll only recognize 2 sexes, male and female.
stating that these are not changeable and are based on incontrovertible reality.
Which is sure to have a huge impact on transgender policies.
Everything from government communications to civil rights protections to federal funding could be affected,
LGBTQ plus advocates are already speaking out against this.
calling it discriminatory and harmful.
They see it as a huge step backwards for transgender rights.
Yeah, this is definitely going to spark a lot of debate about gender identity and the government's role in all of this.
I can already see the headlines.
Me too. Okay, so another executive order that's stirring up controversy.
What's this one about?
Trump is putting a stop to all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs within the federal government.
He called them radical and wasteful.
A pretty big departure from efforts to promote diversity and inclusion in the federal workforce.
And people are not happy about it.
Nope. A lot of folks see DEI programs as crucial for addressing systemic inequalities.
And making sure the government is representative and equitable.
This is going to be another hot button issue for sure.
No doubt. And speaking of hot button issues,
Trump just signed a directive delaying the ban on TikTok,
for another 75 days.
which gives them more time to figure out that deal.
To transfer ownership of TikTok to an American company.
It's a whole saga that just keeps dragging on.
Caught between U.S.-China tensions and all these concerns about data security and national security.
It's a tricky situation with no easy answers.
And definitely one we'll need to keep following.
For sure. Okay, so how about we take a look at who showed up at Trump's inauguration?
Sounds interesting.
It was quite the mix.
A blend of the expected and the unexpected.
From former presidents to tech billionaires to influencers and even some controversial figures.
So who stood out?
Well, you had your tech giants like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg.
Even the CEO of TikTok Shou Zi Chu was there.
which shows how close Trump is with the tech industry.
And how much influence they're likely to have on his policies.
Exactly. And then there was Conor McGregor,
The MMA fighter.
the one and only. He definitely added a bit of unpredictability to the event.
He's definitely a controversial figure.
Known for his legal troubles and outspoken personality.
I guess Trump likes to keep things interesting.
He sure does. Okay, so switching gears now to a more serious topic.
Oh, yeah.
There's some pretty alarming reports coming out of Libya.
About the situation facing Sudanese women refugees.
They fled the violence in Sudan during the civil war,
But now they're trapped in horrible conditions in Libya.
facing exploitation, sexual violence, and a lack of basic necessities.
Just an awful situation all around.
It is, and the international community needs to step up and do something to help these women.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we move on, let's touch on another development with Trump's return to power.
It's definitely shaken things up both here in the U.S. and around the world.
His America First agenda and his skepticism about international institutions.
Plus, his willingness to challenge the status quo.
It's created a lot of uncertainty and new challenges.
Especially for Europe. I think his relationship with Europe is going to be particularly interesting to watch.
They definitely clashed during his first term.
So it'll be interesting to see how things play out this time around.
On the one hand, his protectionist trade policies and his doubts about NATO could cause tension.
But on the other hand, his tough stance on China and his focus on energy independence might align with some of Europe's interests.
It's a complex geopolitical landscape, that's for sure.
Definitely one that requires careful analysis.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground today.
From Elon Musk to Trump to tragedies and triumphs.
It's been quite a whirlwind of news.
It has, but we've still got more to discuss.
Stay tuned, folks. We'll be back in a flash with more news analysis and insights.
It really is a complex situation over there in Europe. Who knows what'll happen?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see how it all unfolds. But before we move on...
You want to go back to Turkey?
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the political stuff, but that hotel fire...
It's just heartbreaking. 76 people lost their lives.
It really makes you think about how important safety regulations are.
In emergency preparedness, we often take those things for granted.
Until something like this happens.
Right, and now authorities are trying to figure out what caused the fire.
And if there were any failings that contributed to the tragedy.
Like, were there any issues with the building codes or the fire safety inspections?
Did they follow proper emergency response protocols? There are a lot of questions that need to be answered.
Definitely. Okay, so on a lighter note, but still important.
What was that?
Formula One just had a pretty big moment.
Oh, yeah. The Haas team, appointing Laura Muller as the first female race engineer.
It's a huge step forward for women in motorsport.
It really is. For a long time, it's been such a male-dominated field.
And now Muller is breaking down barriers and hopefully paving the way for other women.
To follow in her footsteps.
It's great to see.
It is. So, speaking of breaking new ground, what do you think about Thailand legalizing same-sex marriage?
It's a landmark moment for LGBTQ plus rights in Southeast Asia, no doubt.
It took years of activism and advocacy to get to this point.
And they were really smart about their campaigning.
Like how they used those boy love dramas to help shift public opinion.
Yeah, it was brilliant. They tapped into something that was already popular and used it to their advantage.
It just goes to show how powerful pop culture can be.
It really does, and it makes you wonder if this could have a domino effect.
Leading other countries in the region to reconsider their own stance on same-sex marriage.
That would be amazing. I guess we'll have to wait and see, but it's definitely a step in the right direction.
For sure. Okay, so let's talk about Trump's inauguration. The guest list was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it was a real mix of folks.
Some expected, some not so much.
You had your usual suspects like former presidents and politicians.
But then you also had tech giants like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg.
Which really shows how much influence Silicon Valley has these days.
It does, and it makes you think about how that relationship is going to play out during Trump's second term.
Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Okay, so then there was the more unexpected guest, Conor McGregor.
Now that was a surprise.
The MMA fighter? What was he doing there?
Who knows? But it definitely got people talking.
He's a bit of a controversial figure, to say the least.
Yeah, with his legal troubles and his outspoken
I
personality.
guess Trump likes to surround himself with people who make a splash.
He does seem to enjoy the spotlight.
That's for sure. Okay, so speaking of making a splash, Trump's executive orders have been creating quite a stir.
Especially the one about the World Health Organization.
Yeah, his decision to pull the U.S. out of the WHO has a lot of people worried.
There are concerns that it could undermine global health initiatives.
and make it harder to fight infectious diseases and prepare for future pandemics.
Right, and some people are worried that it could give China more power within the WHO.
It's definitely a decision with some potentially serious consequences.
And then there are his executive orders on diversity and gender, which have sparked a lot of debate.
The one about sex being not changeable and based on incontrovertible reality is especially controversial.
LGBTQ plus advocates are really worried about the impact this could have on transgender rights
They see it as a major step backwards.
and are already gearing up for a fight.
It's going to be a long and difficult battle, that's for sure.
And then there's his decision to put an end to all those diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the federal government. He called them radical and wasteful.
Which is a pretty clear sign that he's taking a completely different approach to social issues.
Compared to his predecessor.
And people are divided about it. Some agree with him, while others are outraged.
It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so while we're talking about controversial decisions,
You want to talk about Mozambique?
yeah, the situation there is pretty tense right now.
The opposition leader has said he's willing to serve in the government.
But only if they completely overhaul the electoral system.
He says the current system is rigged.
And there are concerns that this could lead to more violence and instability.
The Biden administration has been criticized for not doing more to help.
Some people say the U.S. has a responsibility to step in and prevent a humanitarian catastrophe.
It's a complicated situation with no easy answers.
That's for sure. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk about those 48 Uyghur refugees detained in Thailand.
They fled persecution in China,
But now they're facing the possibility of being deported back.
where they could face imprisonment and torture,
Human rights groups are urging Thailand to grant them asylum.
and to uphold their international obligations.
It's a really tough situation. And hopefully Thailand will do the right thing.
Okay, so some good news for a change.
Always welcome.
The U.S. managed to get 2 American detainees released from Taliban custody in Afghanistan.
Through a prisoner exchange.
It's a relief for the families of those Americans.
But it does raise some questions about negotiating with groups like the Taliban.
Like, could this encourage more hostage-taking in the future?
It's a tough balancing act.
You want to try to bring your people home safely.
But you also don't want to embolden groups like the Taliban.
Exactly.
It's a real dilemma.
Okay, so remember those mystery balls that washed up on the beaches in Sydney?
Oh, yeah. Whatever happened with those?
Well, it turns out they contain toxic materials.
Like fecal bacteria and E. coli.
Yuck.
I know, right? They're still trying to figure out where they came from.
But it's a reminder that pollution is a serious problem, and that even paradise can have its dangers.
Very true. And speaking of dangers, there's been another concerning development in Ukraine,
Drug-resistant bacteria are spreading rapidly
which is a huge problem because the war has really stretched their healthcare system thin.
and created the perfect conditions for these superbugs to thrive.
Doctors are having a hard time treating infections because the bacteria are resistant to even the strongest antibiotics.
It's a serious situation and one that could have long-term consequences.
Yeah, it shows how war can have ripple effects that go far beyond the battlefield.
Absolutely. So back in the U.S.,
Trump is shaking things up with his executive orders,
he's targeting a lot of different areas.
like healthcare diversity and gender issues.
His decision to halt all those diversity, equity, and inclusion programs is really getting people talking.
Some say it's a necessary step to cut waste and eliminate radical ideology.
While others say it's a direct attack on efforts to make the federal government more equitable and representative.
It's definitely a move that will have lasting impacts on the federal workforce.
No doubt. Okay, and then there's a WHO situation,
The U.S. pulling out of the World Health Organization.
which has a lot of people worried about global health.
They're concerned about what it means for fighting infectious diseases and preparing for future pandemics.
Some people think it could weaken the WHO and give China more influence,
It's definitely a decision with global implications,
and one that we'll need to keep a close eye on.
for sure. Now, shifting gears for a moment, let's talk about the humanitarian crisis in Libya.
The situation there is just awful, especially for Sudanese women refugees.
They're facing exploitation, sexual violence, and a lack of basic necessities.
They fled the horrors of war in Sudan, only to end up in another nightmare.
It's just heartbreaking. And it's a reminder that we need to do more to help those who are suffering.
Absolutely.
Okay, so back to Mozambique.
The opposition leader there is making some bold demands.
He wants a complete overhaul of the electoral system.
He says it's rigged in favor of the ruling party.
And he's refusing to serve in the government until changes are made, which has created a real political stalemate.
And raised fears of more violence and instability.
It's a situation that needs to be resolved peacefully.
For the sake of the people of Mozambique.
Agreed. Okay, so moving on to Israel.
Another stabbing attack in Tel Aviv.
4 people injured, and the attacker was killed,
Hamas praised the attack even though they didn't officially take credit.
which just adds to the tension and fear in the region.
It seems like there's no end in sight to the cycle of violence.
It's really discouraging, but even in the midst of all this turmoil.
There are still some bright spots.
Like what?
Well, there's Laura Miller's appointment as the first female race engineer in Formula One.
Yeah, that was a big win for women in motorsport.
And Thailand legalizing same-sex marriage, that's a major victory for LGBTQ plus rights.
And then there's the release of those American detainees from Taliban custody.
It's good to have something positive to focus on.
It is. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are still good things happening.
And that we need to keep fighting for a better world.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we wrap up,
We want to do a quick recap of the day's top headlines.
sounds good to me.
So, Trump's back in the White House, and he's already making waves with his executive orders.
Covering everything from healthcare to diversity to transgender rights.
Meanwhile, that horrible fire in Turkey claimed the lives of 76 people.
A tragedy that's raised a lot of questions about safety regulations.
Thailand made history by legalizing same-sex marriage.
A huge step forward for LGBTQ plus rights in the region.
And the conflicts in Israel, Ukraine, and Mozambique continue to cause suffering and instability.
It's been a day filled with both good news and bad news.
It really has, but that's the world we live in.
It's complex and ever-changing.
And it's important to stay informed about what's happening.
So we can understand the challenges we face and work towards solutions.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we move on to our last segment,
Let's take a closer look at one of the most compelling stories of the day. All right, we're back for our final stretch here. Let's squeeze in a few more stories before we wrap up for the day.
sounds good. What do you want to talk about?
Well, I thought maybe we could start with something a little bit lighter.
Sure, sounds good to me.
Okay, so amidst all the political drama and international crises.
You just still need a little escape.
Exactly. And it seems a lot of people are finding that escape.
In the pages of Rebecca Yaros's latest book,
Onyx Storm, the newest installment in her Romantasy series, just came out.
and it's already a huge hit.
It sounds like she's really struck a chord with this series.
Oh yeah, she's got a winning formula with her blend of fantasy, romance, and adventure.
And people are just adding it up.
It's a nice reminder that even when the world feels heavy,
There's still room for a little magic and romance.
couldn't agree more. So speaking of wins,
Let's talk about Laura Muller,
Formula One's first female race engineer.
a historic moment for women in motorsport.
It really is. She's breaking down barriers and paving the way for others to follow.
Hopefully this is just the beginning of a more inclusive and diverse future for F1.
Fingers crossed. Okay, so before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to,
Trump's executive orders,
yeah, specifically the one about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
halting all those programs in the federal government.
A lot of people are not happy about this decision
They're saying it could reverse years of progress.
and make the federal workforce less equitable and representative.
It's definitely a controversial move that's going to have a lasting impact.
No doubt. So let's zoom out for a second.
We've talked about a lot today.
A lot of heavy stuff, from controversial gestures and pardons to tragic fires and landmark legal decisions.
It's been a bit of a roller coaster.
It has, but amidst all the chaos and uncertainty, there have been some bright spots too.
Like Thailand's legalization of same-sex marriage.
Laura Miller's appointment as F1's first female race engineer.
And the release of those American detainees from Taliban custody.
It's important to remember those moments of hope,
Because they show us that progress is possible.
even in the face of adversity.
And that's a message we all need to hear right now.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our daily news roundup for January 21st, 2025.
Thanks for joining us today.
We appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you back here tomorrow for more news and analysis.